They say betrayal cuts deepest when it comes from those closest to you. And for Joseph, the favored son of Jacob, that cut came from his own blood. His story didn't begin in the palace, but in a pit, thrown down not by enemies, but by his brothers, fueled by jealousy, blinded by resentment, and deaf to the cries of their younger sibling who'd once dreamed too loudly of greatness. Joseph, 17, clothed in a coat of many colors, a symbol of his father's love and, to his brothers, a daily reminder of their own rejection. Shared visions of sheaves bowing, of stars and suns submitting, not realizing that dreams, even divine ones, don't manifest without pain, pressure, and process. Sold into slavery, stripped of dignity and identity, he arrived in Egypt with nothing but a memory of favor and a heart bruised by betrayal. Yet even there, in a foreign land, among foreign gods with no rights or allies, he didn't spiral into bitterness. Instead, he served Potiphar with integrity, rising through the ranks not because he schemed or manipulated, but because excellence was in his DNA and God's hand was on his life. A reminder that purpose doesn't vanish in hardship, it's often revealed in it. But as Joseph rose, so did temptation, and when Potiphar's wife tried to seduce him, he didn't rationalize or flirt with danger. He ran, valuing his character over comfort, and for that, he was thrown into prison. Not for doing wrong, but for doing right. Proving that obedience doesn't always bring instant reward, but it does bring lasting fruit. In that dungeon, forgotten by man but not by God, Joseph interpreted dreams for fellow prisoners, accurately, selflessly, and without asking for anything in return, though he did plead to be remembered. And yet, he was forgotten, left 2 more years in that dark place, which teaches us that divine timing isn't about fairness. It's about preparation. Joseph needed to learn to lead in tight places before he could govern nations. When Pharaoh finally dreamed dreams no one could interpret, that's when Joseph was called, cleaned up, brought before kings, still humble, still pointing to God as the source, not his own wisdom. And in one conversation, everything shifted. He went from prisoner to prime minister, from forgotten to favored again, because the right door opened at the right time, and he was ready. During famine, the same brothers who sold him showed up desperate, not recognizing the man they'd betrayed. And Joseph, with power to punish, chose mercy, because true greatness isn't measured in control, but in compassion. He tested them, not for revenge, but to see if they changed. And when he saw remorse and unity, he wept. He revealed himself, not with arrogance, but with grace, saying, "You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good." A line that echoes across centuries, because Joseph's life proves that purpose runs deeper than pain, and that God can take what breaks you and use it to bless nations. Reunited with his father, restoring a broken family, Joseph didn't just rise. He healed, he forgave, and he stewarded power without letting it poison him, showing that leadership rooted in trauma can still be redemptive if it's filtered through love and vision. His story reminds us that delay is not denial, that pits are not the end, and that even in our darkest chapters, God is scripting something bigger, something that reaches beyond our wounds to bring provision, restoration, and legacy. And so Joseph, the boy with dreams, became the man with wisdom, not through shortcuts or ease, but through fire, silence, and long seasons of being misunderstood. The same lips that begged for mercy became the voice that fed nations, because Joseph never lost sight of who held the pen, even when the script seemed unfair. He forgave because he saw the hand of God in every twist, understood that the pain wasn't pointless, and that the pit was preparation. He didn't blame, didn't gloat, didn't shut the door on reconciliation. He opened it wider, and when his father Jacob died, and the brothers feared that Joseph's kindness would expire, he reassured them again, not because they deserved it, but because grace is never about deserving. It's about seeing people through God's lens. Joseph wasn't weak. He was powerful in restraint, mighty in mercy, and steady in storms. A portrait of resilience that didn't quit, even when it was buried beneath betrayal. forgotten behind bars, or falsely accused. He led Egypt not with fear, but with foresight, storing grain, preparing for famine, saving lives not just locally but globally, because divine purpose never settles for small reach. And in his rise, we see a man who was never obsessed with status. He never chased the palace. It came to him because he was faithful where he was, whether that was a field, a pit, a house, or a prison. Joseph's journey calls us higher, not just to dream, but to endure, to forgive, and to lead when we get there. He never lost his identity in Egypt. He took on a new name, shaved his beard, wore royal robes, but his heart stayed anchored to the God of his fathers, the God who sees, the God who speaks in dreams, the God who allows pain but never wastes it. And even when he married, even when he had children, Joseph named his sons with remembrance. Manasseh, God has made me forget all my trouble, and Ephraim, God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering, because he refused to let prosperity erase the memory of the process. He didn't deny the pain, he redefined it. And as he stood at the end of his life, having seen generations grow, having seen the promise outlive the pit, he asked one final thing, that his bones be taken when Israel would leave Egypt. Because even in death, Joseph believed in deliverance. He didn't just live by faith, he died in it. He was a dreamer, yes, but he was also a doer, a servant, a leader, a forgiver, a restorer, a man who saw beyond revenge to redemption, and who lived not to get even but to be useful. His journey reminds us that what looks like a setback may be God setting the stage, and that sometimes the palace is the least important part of the story. It's who we become in the pit, in the prison, in the process, that prepares us to wear the robe without losing our soul. And in the grand sweep of Scripture, Joseph's story is a seed, a whisper of the greater Joseph to come, Jesus, who was also betrayed by his brothers, sold for silver, falsely accused, thrown into the grave, but who rose not just to reign, but to redeem, who also wept, also forgave, also ruled with compassion, and who now calls us to do the same. So when we read Joseph's story, we're not just reading ancient history, we're reading a pattern, a promise, a call to endure with purpose, to rise with humility, to forgive with intention, and to lead with love, knowing that every pit has a purpose, every prison has a passage, and every dream, when held with integrity, will find its place in God's time. Because he is not just the giver of dreams, he is the finisher of them too. And yet the deeper truth of Joseph's journey wasn't just the dramatic arc from slave to sovereign, but the quiet decisions made in silence, in suffering, in solitude. Moments that never made headlines but shaped his soul more than any crown could. Because real strength isn't forged in comfort, but in the fire of rejection, isolation, and restraint. And Joseph lived long stretches where nothing made sense, where dreams mocked him more than comforted him, where faith didn't fast forward the pain, but required him to endure it without explanation. Think about it. 17 and sold, Genesis 37:28. No goodbye, no closure, just thrown into a world that didn't speak his language or care about his value. And still he chose to serve, not because the environment was fair, but because he refused to let bitterness define him, because excellence wasn't a performance for people. It was who he was. And maybe that's the key. Joseph didn't need a stage to act with character, didn't need applause to be faithful, and didn't wait for recognition to rise. He just kept showing up, kept working, kept believing, even when it felt like God had gone silent. And that prison season wasn't short. It stretched on, day after day, routine after routine, with no visible reward, which is where most people quit, where hearts harden and hope dies. But Joseph didn't let time rob him of vision. He interpreted dreams for others, Genesis 40, even while his own seemed dead, spoke hope into someone else's future, even while his present was suffocating, which shows us something huge, that ministry, leadership, impact. It doesn't start on platforms. It starts in dungeons, in obscure places where the only audience is God, and the only fuel is faith. And then, when Pharaoh's moment came, Genesis 41. Joseph didn't hesitate. He didn't say, "Finally my time." He said, "God will give Pharaoh the answer." Genesis 41:16. Pointing upward before he even opened his mouth, anchoring the moment in divine dependence, not self-confidence. And when Pharaoh promoted him, gave him authority, gave him robes, rings, chariots, and power. Genesis 41:41-43. Joseph didn't lose himself in the luxury. He stayed rooted, strategic, focused. And what's wild is how his leadership didn't just save Egypt. It prepared the region, because godly purpose always expands beyond borders. And when the famine pushed his brothers to Egypt, Genesis 42, Joseph had a decision to make. Not just about feeding them, but about facing his past. Would he respond out of his pain or his purpose? Would he replay the betrayal or release it? And we see his heart wrestle. He doesn't act instantly, he observes, he listens. He sets scenarios in motion that force his brothers to confront who they become. And it's not revenge, it's redemption in real time. Because Joseph isn't just trying to help them survive. He's trying to heal a wound that's fractured his family for decades. And when he finally reveals himself, Genesis 45:1-4, when he says, "I am Joseph," it's not just a name, it's a moment of transformation where all the layers of pain and process converge. And what could have been a scene of vengeance becomes a sanctuary of reconciliation. And as they embrace, as he weeps over Benjamin, over Judah, over the ones who once hated him, we see that forgiveness isn't forgetting the past. It's choosing not to be owned by it. And bringing Jacob to Egypt wasn't just about comfort. It was about restoration, about letting his father see what God had done, about completing the circle, not with anger, but with honor. And when Jacob blesses Pharaoh, Genesis 47:7-10, we see a beautiful twist. The shepherd from Canaan blessing the king of Egypt, because God's people, even in foreign lands, carry divine authority. And after Jacob dies, Genesis 50:15-21, Joseph could have rewritten the rules, but he doesn't. He reassures his brothers, carries their fear, and chooses again to protect them, showing that consistent character is the real fruit of divine transformation. And as he grows older, watches Ephraim and Manasseh grow, Genesis 48, watches Israel multiply in a land that once enslaved him. Joseph understands that legacy isn't about titles. It's about what you build that outlasts you. He could have chosen bitterness 1,000 times, but he didn't. He chose grace, chose to trust a God who doesn't waste betrayal, who doesn't forget his promises, even when the route is longer, harder, and more painful than expected. And we can look at Joseph and admire his rise, but what should really inspire us is how he handled the pit, how he walked through false accusations, how he waited in prison, how he didn't let years of silence become the graveyard for his calling. Because most people want the palace moments, the breakthroughs, the promotion, but they don't realize the cost of character that comes with it. And Joseph paid in private for what God honored in public. And in today's world, where revenge is glorified and quick success is idolized, Joseph stands out as a blueprint for slow, steady, God-authored greatness. A kind that endures, that doesn't just survive storms but comes out wiser, stronger, kinder. And maybe that's what we need to remember, that the pit wasn't a punishment, it was positioning. The prison wasn't a dead end, it was preparation, and the palace wasn't a reward. It was responsibility, because every phase had purpose and every detour was divine. And if you're reading this today, feeling forgotten, feeling stuck, wondering if the dream you once carried is ever coming to pass, remember Joseph. Remember that delays are not denials, that even silence can be sacred, that favor doesn't always look like ease, and that the same God who was with Joseph in the pit, Genesis 39:2-3, in Potiphar's house, in the prison, was the same God who elevated him in the palace, not because Joseph demanded it, but because he was ready for it. And as history closed the chapter on Joseph's life, it didn't end with his achievements. It ended with a coffin, a promise, and a prophecy. Genesis 50:24-26, reminding us that purpose never dies, and that bones buried in faith still speak of future resurrection, still point to a God who finishes what he starts.